And welcome back. In a few sets of videos ago, we talked about the hierarchy for managing and working with a vSphere environment. And it was like having a vice president here that managed a few managers, and those managers managed the employees. Well, it's just like that with vSphere. With vSphere, we have vCenter that's managing the ESXi hosts, which are then providing the services for one or more VMs running on those ESXi hosts. Now, the problem so far in our deployment is that we deployed ESXi hosts. We've deployed vCenter. However, we haven't linked our ESXi host and told them that they're supposed to be managed by the vCenter server. So that's what we get to do in this video, is make that connection and tell vCenter, you get to manage these hosts. And by doing that, by linking them together, we can then start managing the ESXi host and their VMs that they're supporting from one pane of glass called vCenter. So that's what we're going to do right now, is we're going to bring in 4 ESXi hosts to be managed under our vCenter server. So just a reminder of where everything is. We've got 3 ESXi hosts, 1, 2, and 3 at .101, .102, .103. We also have ESXi 4 at .104, which has a brand new VM that it's running on that ESXi host, which is our vCenter server appliance at .111. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this vCenter and we're going to tell it, you should start managing this ESXi host and this one and this one and this one. So it's going to manage its own ESXi host that the VM is actually running on. But the cool thing is that once we have it set up, we can then just log into vCenter and manage any ESXi host and or any virtual machine that's running on any of those ESXi hosts. So to do that, we're going to open up the vSphere client to vCenter and add those ESXi hosts in right now. So we're currently logged into vCenter, and from a perspective of where in vCenter we are, if we click on menu, I've just gone to a location called hosts and clusters. And from here, I'm going to right click on this vcsa.nuggetlab.com. That's our vCenter server. I'm going to right click, and from the drop down, I'm going to select new data center. And I'm going to go ahead and call this LV Nevada. That happens to be where I'm at. So let's imagine I'm creating a new data center here in Nevada. I'll click on OK. And there's this new logical container called a data center. And then within that, let me go ahead and I'm going to create a new cluster. Think of a cluster like a group of something, like a group of ESXi hosts, perhaps. And I'm going to click on new cluster. And I'm going to call this cluster 1. Just so that when we see it, we'll know, oh, that's a cluster. It's a logical grouping. And later on, as we continue through, we'll enable additional features and functions, and we'll use all these other options going forward. But for now, we're just going to create a basic cluster to contain some of our ESXi hosts. And then we'll click on Next. It's asking us to confirm, and we'll click on Finish. So now we have this cluster called Cluster 1, and now it's saying, hey, do you want to bring in some hosts? This is the quick start. So effectively, for the cluster, we're on Configure and Quick Start. And it's asking us, do we want to add some hosts? So there's a couple ways we could do this. We could right click on the cluster and say add hosts. That would walk us through a menu. Or we could click here on add for add hosts under the quick start. And that gives us the option to bring in hosts as well. So we'll go ahead and let's mix it up. Let's do a few one way and a few the other. So we'll click on add. And now it's saying, okay, what is the IP address or fully qualified domain name for the first host you want to bring in? So let's bring in ESXi.1. Now it did ask for a fully qualified domain name. So we'll go ahead and put nuggetlab.com. And this ESXi host is not just going to let any vCenter server manage it. It has to have the right permissions. So we're going to specify the root username over on ESXi1, as well as the password associated with that. And when we do this, vCenter server is going to connect to those devices, supply those credentials, and that's what gives the vCenter permission to bring those ESXi hosts into the fold. So we'll specify root. That's a username over on our ESXi hosts. And we'll specify the lab password once again. Now, instead of doing this just one by one, let's go ahead and add ESXi2 as well. And instead of having to put the password in, I'm going to say use the same credentials for all hosts. It'll just use the same username and password across all of them. And let's also bring in ESXi3. And this is often a time when we find out that DNS isn't working. So we checked DNS previously. I think we're good to go. So with those 3 ESXi hosts listed, we'll go ahead in the wizard here and we'll click on Next. Now it's showing us the SHA-1 thumbprints on each of those devices. So if we wanted to verify those, we could. We could just go to one of those hosts. Let's go to ESXi1 and we'll just type F2 to go ahead and log into the direct console user interface. We'll supply the password and then just go down to view support information. And here we can verify the thumbprint. So it's ending in 71E5. Let's double check that from vCenter. So we'll go back to our vSphere client. It's 71E5, and I'm sure the others are spot on too. So we'll go ahead and check the box to bring in all of them and click on OK. It's giving us a summary of the versions and the hosts that are going to be brought in, and that looks good to me. And we'll click on Next. And it says hosts will enter maintenance mode before they are moved into the cluster. You might need to either power off or migrate powered on and suspend virtual machines. All right, so we'll click on Finish, and it is doing its magic and it's bringing in ESXi 1, 2, and 3. We'll give that just a moment to complete its work. All right, looks like it's done. So we can also click on Refresh here. All right, so we've added some hosts. If we scroll down to the wizard, it gives us some additional options to configure the cluster. We'll do that a little bit later in a separate set of videos. And it's showing that these 3 ESXi hosts are all in maintenance mode. That's a little worker barricade across that server. So we're going to bring them up out of maintenance mode. We can just right click, and on maintenance mode, we can say exit maintenance mode. And now, because vCenter is managing these devices, we tell vCenter what we want to have happen, and vCenter talks to the hosts and makes it happen. So we'll bring those all up. And then if we click on Summary for the cluster, and so on the summary for the cluster, it's showing us the combined total resources for CPU, memory, and storage. I still have a little warning sign on each one, so I'm just going to check and see what that is. I'm going to click on the ESXi1 host. Oh, and here's just indicating that the shell is enabled and SSH is enabled. I'm going to go ahead and suppress that warning for that guy. Thank you very much for letting me know. And let's do the same thing for ESXi 2 and 3. And we are good to go. Now, if we want to change the name of the cluster, we can. We can just right click on the cluster. And also, this is another thing I want to point out. With you can right click on almost any object here and go to the menu for it, but it doesn't change the underlying screen. So if you want to deal with the cluster or some other objects, just click on it once, and that puts the screen over here. And then when you're right clicking on it and bringing down the menu, it's not going to confuse you about what you're actually looking at. So we're focused on the cluster, and with the drop down, we'll go to rename right here. It's going to rename it, and let's call this cluster prod 1. Now, what is missing from this picture? We don't yet have brought into vCenter ESXi 4, which is actually running the virtual machine for the vCenter server appliance. So I would suggest let's bring that in as well. Let's create a new cluster just for management devices. So at the data center for Las Vegas, Nevada, we'll right click. In fact, I'll click on it to select it. Then I'll right click, say we want a new cluster, and let's call this new cluster V Management. And I'm just going to put the V in there because I want it to show up at the bottom. It's going to sort it alphabetically for me. So I'm going to call it V Management. We're not going to turn on any special features yet. We'll click on Next, click on Finish. And then I'm not going to use the quick start for it, but rather for this new management cluster, I'm going to go ahead and right click on it. And from the drop down, I'm going to select Add Hosts. That's the way we can manually add ESXi hosts into the cluster. So we'll put in the information for ESXi-4, which is hosting our vCenter server appliance. The username there is root. This is the ESXi4 root user account. And the password is our lab password, which I will supply. And then we'll click on Next. So it's showing here, okay, I've reached out to ESXi4. That's the thumbprint. I'll check that to indicate we want to bring it in. Click on OK. And it has a warning. And what is that warning? The warning is, oh, we have one powered on VM. It's the vCenter server appliance. Yes, it is. It's the thing that we're currently connected to. So this is a little bit meta, but we're going to bring in the ESXi host that's actually running this vCenter server appliance so that vCenter can manage that ESXi host. So with that warning accepted, we'll click on Next. Then it says host will enter maintenance mode before they are moved to the cluster. But I got news for you. The vCenter server is running on this ESXi host, and it has no other options at the moment to be migrated. We haven't set up any of the tools for vMotion or anything else. So it's going to bring it in, but it's not going to put it in maintenance mode. And that's partly because vCenter server appliance is the brains that's running this whole orchestration. So even though it says that, it's not going to put this host, ESXi4, in maintenance mode. It's just going to add it into the cluster we specified. All right, so with that, we'll click on Finish. And there's ESXi4 coming in. Down here, it's showing us some progress bars for what's happening. And it says it's done. All right, and there's our vCenter server appliance, the VM that's running on that ESXi host. So we'll go to that ESXi host. So I'll suppress the warnings regarding secure shell and click on yes. And then I'll go ahead and click on refresh. All right, we are good to go. So we've got the production cluster with our 3 ESXi hosts, and we have a separate cluster just for management with a single host ESXi4, which currently has the vCenter server appliance running on it. And then from a licensing perspective, now that we've brought all these devices in, to do licensing, we go back to the menu, go down to administration. On the left, select licenses right here. We'd click on add licenses. We'd add our licenses for ESXi host and for vCenter. And then once we brought the licenses in, we would go to assets. And this is going to show us under the vCenter server systems, all of our vCenters. And we'd simply go ahead and click on that, and we'd apply one of the licenses that we'd brought in. For hosts, it's going to list our ESXi hosts. I'm going to go ahead and minimize the task down here so we have a little more real estate. So here it's showing us our 4 ESXi hosts, and we could go ahead and assign licenses to them as well once we've imported them. And that's how we'd apply our licenses. So I'll go back to menu and back to hosts and clusters. And the cool thing here is that if we click on the cluster, it's going to show us the resources. If we click on the summary tab up here, a summary of all the resources in that cluster. If we click on a specific host, it'll show us the resources and information based on that specific host. It's pretty convenient. So let's take a quick inventory of what we've done so far. We have installed the vCenter server appliance. We have logged into the management interface for the vCenter server appliance. We logged into vCenter using the vSphere client. We added the hosts so that vCenter could then manage it, and that's where we are at this point in our journey. So what's left to do? Well, the only thing left to do is for you to do it. So in the very next video, I'm going to present the lab that I'd like you to do from soup to dessert as far as deploying vCenter, getting it up and running, check out the management interface, and then import or bring in the ESXi hosts so that vCenter can manage it, just like what we did in the demos up to this point. So in the next video, I'll present the scenario and have you go at it for the hands-on lab. So I'll see you there in just a moment. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to